So good morning. My name is Shamlai, son of Hanan, and I'm here to tell you my story. But to tell you my story, I'll have to go back a bit so it will make sense, because my story is just part of the story of God's people. Now, I hope you know at least about Jerusalem, the great city I live in, and my people. I'm from the tribe of Judah, one of the sons of Israel, a son of Abraham. This is the land that God promised us, that he led us into. The great King David captured this city, and his son Solomon built the temple to our God here. And you might have thought that if God had given us this land, that once we were living here, everyone would live happily ever after. But that's not how this story goes. You see, our God made promises to us, but these promises had two sides. On one side, he promised us this land, all the good things we would need if we followed him. On the other side, he promised that if we reject him, if we go worship the other gods like the nations, that things would not go well. And he even promised that if we kept on doing the wrong thing, this land he had given us, the land itself, would vomit us out. And now you might think that sounds simple and obvious. How could it be that hard? Don't be silly about it, just follow God. But we didn't do so well at that. And after hundreds of years, God had enough of us ignoring him, rejecting him, chasing after all those other gods. And so it happened just like he promised. We got kicked out of this land. The Babylonians claimed we couldn't stop them. There were too many of them. There were hordes of them, just like the locusts. They pulled down the walls of Jerusalem. They burned the city. They took all the gold, the silver. They even destroyed the temple. I mean, that was supposed to be where God dwelled with his people on earth. But it was no more. I'm glad I wasn't there. The stories I heard growing up were terrible. And they didn't just take away the money and the stuff. They took us away too. My people, they led away into a strange land. We had to build whole new lives from only what we could carry with us. It was a hard time. We still sing some of the songs they wrote then. Things like, "By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept." I can tell you, it sounds like there was a whole lot of soul searching going on. Why did this happen? Where is God? But God hadn't abandoned us. He still spoke to us through the prophets. They reminded us of who God is, all he had done for us. They reminded us of his promises, how he had been true to all his promises, even when we weren't. In fact, sending us off into exile was just God being faithful to what he'd already said. But the prophets, they also painted a picture of hope for us. I mean, my favorite was always hearing what Ezekiel saw. He had plenty to say about the temple, starting with how he saw a vision of God leaving the temple before it was destroyed. But then later he saw this great vision of the temple rebuilt. The temple was back, bigger and better than before. There was a great river that brought life to the land, and all the tribes were gathered around. It sounded so good. Now, don't get me wrong, the prophets didn't make life easy. My grandfather told me stories of the struggles to stay faithful to God in this new land. He knew some of the people who were thrown into a furnace because they were trying to do the right thing, trying to follow God. But somehow God protected them. And maybe it was things like that which led the new rulers to say that we could come back to our land, come back to Jerusalem. Now, I don't remember much of the journey. I was pretty young when we came back. About all I remember is my mum threatening to leave me behind in a cave when I asked, "Are we there yet?" But we did all make it here, and I've been here ever since. We rebuilt the city. We built back the walls to keep us safe. We built our houses. I mean, I know it was hard work. As soon as I was old enough, I was helping out. And we even rebuilt the temple. I remember the day we finished. We had such a party. But while we were celebrating, I saw some of the old men sitting and crying. I thought it was weird then, but now I understand. They knew what the old temple was like. And this new one, well, there's nothing like it. It was smaller, simpler. We didn't have the gold and everything else that they'd had back the first time. And it wasn't like Ezekiel had promised. We built the temple, but nothing changed. We didn't see God come back like they'd seen him come into the first temple when they built it. We weren't freed from the empire. Hey, many of my people didn't even bother coming back. They'd built their new lives. They didn't want to leave it all and start again. So, well, nothing really changed. We went on with life. We had a temple now where we could take our offerings, but that was about it. Until one day, another prophet came. His name was Malachi, and he came to tell us that God was not happy with us. In fact, we wrote down what he said to us, so I can read some of it to you now. A prophecy, the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord, but you ask, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob. But Esau I have hated, and I turned his hill country into a wasteland and left his inheritance to the desert jackals. Edom may say, though we've been crushed, we will rebuild the ruins. But this is what the Lord Almighty says. They may build, but I will demolish. They will be called the wicked land, a people always under the wrath of God. You will see it with your own eyes and say, great is the Lord, even beyond the borders of Israel. A son honors his father and a slave his master. If I am a father, where is the honor due to me? If I am a master, where is the respect due to me, says the Lord Almighty. It is your priests who show contempt for my name. But you ask, how have we shown contempt for your name? By offering defiled food on my altar. But you ask, how have we defiled you? By saying the Lord's table is contemptible. When you offer blind animals for sacrifice, is that not wrong? When you sacrifice lame or diseased animals, is that not wrong? Try offering them to your governor. Would he be pleased with you? Would he accept you? Says the Lord Almighty. Now, plead with God to be gracious to us. With such offerings from your hands, will he accept you? Says the Lord Almighty. Oh, that one of you would shut the temple doors so you would not light useless fires on my altar. I am not pleased with you, says the Lord Almighty, and I will accept no offering from your hands. My name will be great among the nations, from where the sun rises to where it sets. In every place, incense and pure offerings will be brought to me, because my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord Almighty. But you profane it by saying the Lord's table is defiled and its food is contemptible. And you say, what a burden. And you sniff at it contemptuously, says the Lord Almighty. When you bring injured, lame, or diseased animals and offer them as sacrifices, should I accept them from your hands, said the Lord? Cursed is the cheat who has an acceptable male in his flock and vows to give it, but then sacrifices a blemished animal to the Lord. For I am a great king, says the Lord Almighty, and my name is to be feared among the nations. Now I can tell you that sure unsettled us. We knew that rejecting God was what set off all these problems in the first place, getting kicked out of Jerusalem and dragged off into exile. We sure didn't want that to happen again. And yet here we have God telling us that he won't accept any offerings from us. I guess we hadn't really realized where we were at, just how bad things has got. You know what it's like, I'm sure. Little step by little step, you head off in the wrong direction. And sometimes you need that jolt to realize just how far off track you've got. And, well, let me tell you, Malachi sure knew how to jolt. And he got even more confronting as he went on, but we'll save that for another time. But you see, we'd really got caught up on this question. Does God love us? Now, I don't know about you, but I've asked that question once or twice before. I know some of my friends have too. There were different things that led us to ask the question. For me, it was when I needed work and I wasn't getting it. I trained up, I thought I was going the way God wanted me, but then it didn't all fall into place like I imagined. I started to wonder why God had taken me on this journey only to be left struggling afterwards, feeling like I had no place. No one wanted me. I wondered if God actually cared about me. For my friend, it was when his dad got sick. He prayed. He had the doctors come round. But he didn't get better. He got more and more sick. And then he died. And after that, he was asking whether God actually loved him, loved his family, loved his dad. I mean, even some of the prophets asked questions of God. I mean, some of them sure had it rough. Although I'm not sure that any of them had it rougher than Jeremiah. He was trying to tell people to do the right thing, and his own people turned on him. He was trying to do what God said, and it was those who were supposed to be God's people who made his life miserable. I mean, I'm sure for most of us that would be enough to wonder what God's doing if he really loved us when it's God's people who hurt us. And I mean, sure, the whole idea of asking questions of God was not something new for us after our exile. The songs of our ancestors, the Psalms, they ask the questions, where is God? What's he doing? Does he still care? Saying, I'm hurting, God. Why won't you answer my prayer yet? But what happened with us was a bit different. We'd worked hard rebuilding the city, rebuilding the houses, the walls around the city, and of course the temple. We thought this was it. God was going to restore us, restore the nation of Israel now, just like the prophets had promised. But then it didn't work out. There was no glory filling the temple, like we'd heard about when Solomon first built it. We were still under the rule of the Persians, and now, sure, they weren't the worst. They let us come back, let us rebuild, but we still had to do what they said. We weren't a nation, not really. I mean, we hardly controlled more than the hills around this city. Nothing like what the great King Solomon ruled. We were sad. We were disappointed. Then we got worried. Maybe we'd got it wrong. Was it something we'd said, something we'd done? Did we not get the temple right? Is that why God hasn't acted? And some of us even got a bit angry. God was supposed to do what he promised. He's supposed to be our God. We're supposed to be his people. What's going on? Can we even trust him? By the time Malachi came along, we'd got well past just asking the question, though. We'd decided on the answers. And now perhaps if you'd asked us straight out, we wouldn't have admitted it. But we'd all just shared in our frustrations so much, our questions, and we just got stuck there. And that colored everything we did. We'd decided that God didn't really care about us. He didn't really love us anymore. And the big problem, as Malachi showed us, is that our attitude had corroded our worship. I mean, worshipping our God was supposed to be a joy and a privilege, a time to celebrate, a time to find peace, a time to remember God's love. But once we'd taken that love out of it, it was just a chore, a burden. So we did as little as we thought we could get away with. We were bringing God our leftovers as our offerings, the animals that were sick, diseased, deformed. God asked for our best, and we just gave him what we didn't really want anymore. I mean, when Malachi asked us that question, what would happen if we tried giving those animals to the governor? Now that really stung, because there's no way the governor would take them. He's not blind. I mean, if we tried that, we'd be lucky to get away with only being whipped. It would be showing him such disrespect. He wouldn't stand for it. And yet that was just what we were doing with God. And I hear you've been just giving people gifts. So think about it this way. If you're just about to head out the door and you grabbed some sad-looking thing that's just sitting there, you were thinking you'd probably have to chuck out, but you took it and gave it as a present to your mum, your dad, your son or your daughter, your best friend, how would they take it? And not as a joke, a bit of fun, but like that was really the one and only thing you'd give them. What would they feel? Well, that's just what we were doing with God. And we realized then that it was a big problem. Although we still needed Malachi to remind us why it was so much of a problem. He told us what was really at stake was God's reputation. You see, as God's people, our job was to show the whole world how good God is. But by acting like he didn't matter, like he didn't notice what we were doing, he didn't love us, I mean, that just showed everyone else that God didn't really matter. They could ignore him too. We made him out to be no better than all those other gods out there. I mean, that's why God said it would be better if we just shut the doors to the temple, stopped offering any sacrifices. You see, what we were doing was even worse than nothing. We weren't showing the world that God had done great things. We weren't showing them just how much God loved us, how much we loved him in return. We weren't showing them that God was so much better and greater than all those other things in the world. No, we were just like everyone else, trying to hang on to as much of our stuff as we could, make the best of this life for ourselves. But how to fix things? That was the big question. We were in so deep with this questioning of God, not believing that he loved us and living just for ourselves, we couldn't just change. We couldn't just flick a switch and suddenly be better people, be who God wanted us to be. But fortunately, Malachi had given us a hint about something we could try. He reminded us about how he cared for Israel and opposed Edom. Now, Edom, those were the people who rejected God. They always set themselves against God's people, attacking us, trying to cause trouble wherever they could. Like, if anyone was against us, Edom would be their best friend. And that's why God was against them. Now, if only we could remember all that God had done for us, then perhaps we wouldn't question God's love like we were. If we remembered our long story, how our God is a God who saves, how God led us out of slavery into the promised land, how he'd sent his prophets to try and keep us on the right track, to give us hope even when we'd failed. And so we remembered how God had kept on coming through when we needed him. We remembered how he heard us when we cried out. We remembered how he would forgive us, giving us second, third, fourth chances and more every time we turned back to him. When we looked back, that's how we knew that, yes, God does love us. He still loves us, even if it's not all like we'd hoped. You see, our God is a good Father, caring for us. He just wanted us to love him back, to love him like a father, for what we did, to show that he mattered, that we'd seen all he'd done for us, his salvation, his provision, the way he was with us and heard us and saw us. You see, he wanted our actions to tell all this to the world, to show everyone that he is a good God, a loving Father, a great king over all kings. I hope that you too can see that this is who God is, that you too might love him and worship him as he deserves, not with leftovers, but with love.